Imagine spending 30 years in a royal palace, walking through corridors filled with whispers, standing silent in corners during family arguments, cleaning rooms where secrets were spoken and never ever telling a soul what you witnessed. That was Margaret Flynn's life. She knew which prince was gambling away the family fortune. She knew about the affair that nearly destroyed the monarchy. She knew who really made the decisions behind closed doors. And she never said a word. Until the day the dying queen summoned her to the royal bedchamber and asked one simple question that would unravel 50 years of carefully kept secrets. The answer Margaret gave that day would change how the world saw the royal family forever. If stories about loyalty, secrets, and the hidden lives of the powerful fascinate you, make sure to subscribe. Margaret Flynn was 62 years old when the call came. She was in the servants' quarters of Buckingham Palace, pressing one of the Queen's day dresses when the private secretary appeared at her door, his face grave. "The Queen is asking for you," he said quietly. "Immediately." Margaret's hands stilled on the iron. In 30 years of service, the Queen had never asked for her personally. The protocol was clear. Maids were summoned through the household staff, not directly. Something was wrong. "Is Her Majesty unwell?" Margaret asked, already knowing the answer. The secretary's expression told her everything. "Please come now." Margaret followed him through the private corridors of the palace, her sensible shoes making soft sounds on the carpeted floors. They passed portraits of monarchs long dead, their painted eyes seeming to follow her progress. She had walked these halls countless times over 3 decades, but never with this sense of finality, of something ending. They reached the Queen's private chambers. The secretary knocked softly and opened the door. "Mrs. Flynn, Your Majesty." Margaret stepped inside and the door closed behind her with a quiet click. The Queen lay in her bed, propped up by pillows, looking smaller and more fragile than Margaret had ever seen her. At 89 years old, Her Majesty had ruled for over 60 years, but the woman in the bed was not the strong monarch the world knew. She was simply an elderly woman approaching the end of her life. "Come closer, Margaret," the Queen said, her voice weak but clear. "Sit beside me." Margaret approached hesitantly and sat in the chair that had been placed by the bedside. Up close, she could see how the Queen's hands trembled slightly, how her breathing was labored. "Your Majesty, is there anything I can bring you? Anything you need?" The Queen smiled faintly. "What I need, Margaret, cannot be brought on a tray. I have something to ask you, something I should have asked long ago." Margaret waited, her hands folded in her lap, her heart beating faster than it should. "You have served this family for 30 years, the Queen continued. "You have been in rooms where history was made and unmade. You have seen us at our best and our worst. You have kept our secrets, cleaned up our messes, both literal and figurative. And you have done so with a discretion and loyalty that I have always appreciated, even if I never properly expressed it. It has been my honor to serve Your Majesty and the royal family," Margaret said quietly. "Has it?" the Queen asked, and there was something searching in her eyes. "Has it truly been an honor, or has it been a burden?" Margaret didn't know how to answer that question. Because the truth was complicated. The truth was both. The Queen seemed to understand her silence. "I am dying, Margaret. The doctors give me perhaps a week, maybe less. And I find myself thinking about my life, about the choices I made, the sacrifices I demanded of others, the image we maintained at all costs. I find myself wondering about truth." She paused, gathering strength. "So I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Not as my servant, not with the discretion you've shown for 3 decades, but as one human being to another at the end of a long life. Can you do that for me?" Margaret's throat was tight. "Yes, Your Majesty." The Queen looked directly into her eyes. "Tell me the truth about my family. Tell me what you've seen, all of it. The things you were never supposed to mention, the secrets you've kept, the moments you witnessed that we pretended didn't happen. I want to know. Before I die, I want to know the truth about the life I lived and the family I raised." Margaret felt the weight of 30 years pressing down on her. All the secrets, all the silences, all the things she had seen and never spoken about. The Queen was asking her to break the one rule that had governed her entire career: never tell. "Your Majesty," Margaret said carefully, "are you certain you want to know? Some things once said cannot be unsaid." "I am dying," the Queen replied. "I have lived a life of carefully managed appearances, of duty over truth, of silence in the name of preserving an institution. Now, at the end, I want to know what was real, what was true. Please, Margaret, this is my last request." Margaret took a deep breath, and then she began to speak. But to understand what Margaret told the Queen that day, you need to understand how she came to be in that position in the first place. You need to know how a girl from a poor Irish family ended up as a keeper of royal secrets. You need to know Margaret's story. Margaret Flynn was born in Dublin in 1962, the youngest of 6 children in a family that could barely afford to feed them all. Her father worked in a factory, her mother took in washing. They lived in a cramped flat that always smelled of boiled cabbage and damp. Education was a luxury the Flynns couldn't afford beyond the basics. Margaret left school at 14 to work in a hotel laundry, spending 12-hour days washing sheets and towels for tourists who never saw her face. It was hard work, but Margaret was grateful for it. It kept food on the table. She was 17 when she saw the advertisement. "Housekeeping positions available, Buckingham Palace, room and board provided, experience required." Margaret had no formal experience beyond the laundry, but she was desperate for a chance at something better. She wrote a letter in her best handwriting, borrowed money for the ferry to London, and showed up for an interview in the only dress she owned that didn't have patches. The head housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Pemberton, looked her up and down with obvious skepticism. "You're very young, and you have no references from private service." "No, ma'am," Margaret admitted, "but I'm a hard worker. I learn quickly, and I know how to keep my mouth shut." Mrs. Pemberton's eyebrow rose slightly. "That last quality is more important here than anywhere else you'll ever work. Do you understand that?" "Yes, ma'am." The royal family values discretion above all else. What you see, what you hear, stays within these walls, always. If you cannot maintain absolute silence about the family's private affairs, you have no place here." "I understand, ma'am." Mrs. Pemberton studied her for another long moment, then sighed. "Very well. 2-week trial period. If you prove satisfactory, we'll make it permanent. You'll start in the lower housekeeping staff, cleaning, laundry, basic duties. Wages are modest but fair, and you'll have a room in the servants' quarters. Do you accept?" Margaret accepted before the woman could change her mind. Her first day at Buckingham Palace was overwhelming. The scale of the place, the endless rooms, the strict protocols, the hierarchy among the servants themselves. Margaret quickly learned that the palace below stairs was its own world, with its own rules and social structures. She also learned that invisibility was part of the job. When family members or important guests were present, servants were expected to blend into the background, to be functional but unnoticed. You learn to move quietly, to lower your eyes, to be present but not present. Margaret excelled at invisibility. Perhaps because she had spent most of her life feeling invisible anyway. She worked hard, showed up early, stayed late when needed, and most importantly, she kept her mouth shut. Other staff members would gossip during breaks. sharing tidbits about what they'd overheard or seen. Margaret would listen but never contribute. She understood instinctively that gossip was currency in the palace, and she refused to spend it. Mrs. Pemberton noticed. After 6 months, she promoted Margaret from general housekeeping to the personal household staff. After 2 years, Margaret became one of the ladies' maids responsible for the Queen's wardrobe, her private rooms, her personal effects. This was when Margaret began to see behind the carefully maintained public image of the royal family. This was when the secrets started. The first secret Margaret learned was small but telling. She was cleaning the Queen's private sitting room when she found a letter crumpled in the wastebasket. It was from one of the princes apologizing for a gambling debt. The amount made Margaret's eyes widen. £50,000 lost in a single night at a private club. She should have simply emptied the bin and forgotten what she'd seen. That's what a good servant would do. But Margaret smoothed out the letter, read it again, and understood. This was the real life of the royal family. Behind the state dinners and public appearances, they were human. They made mistakes. They had weaknesses. And someone had to know about those weaknesses to protect them from becoming public. Margaret replaced the letter in the bin exactly as she'd found it. She never mentioned it, but she filed it away in her mind, understanding that this knowledge might someday be important. The secrets accumulated slowly over the years. Margaret was there when one of the princesses had a breakdown after a failed relationship. Sobbing in her room for hours while Margaret quietly held her hand. She was there when heated arguments erupted between family members, usually about money or duty or the impossible expectations of royal life. She learned which family members were kind to the staff and which ones treated them like furniture. She learned who drank too much, who took pills to sleep, who was genuinely happy, and who was merely performing happiness for the cameras. By her 10th year of service, Margaret had become indispensable to the Queen, not because she was the best at pressing clothes or arranging closets, but because the Queen trusted her completely. Trust in a palace full of people with their own agendas and connections to the press was the rarest commodity of all. "You never repeat what you hear, do you, Margaret?" the Queen had asked her once quite suddenly, while Margaret was helping her dress for a state dinner. "No, Your Majesty. Never." "Why not? Other staff members gossip. Some even sell stories to the tabloids. The money must be tempting for someone in your position." Margaret had paused, considering her answer carefully. "Because my word is all I have, Your Majesty. If I break confidence once, I'm the kind of person who breaks confidence. I'd rather be poor and trustworthy than rich and a liar." The Queen had looked at her in the mirror, their eyes meeting. "Thank you, Margaret. That means more than you know." It was the closest thing to personal warmth the Queen had ever shown her, and Margaret treasured it. But the trust came with a price. The more the Queen trusted Margaret, the more Margaret saw, and some of what she saw was difficult to carry. There was the affair. Margaret discovered it by accident when she was organizing the Queen's private correspondence. A letter from a man addressed to a name that wasn't the Queen's, forwarded through a complicated routing system. The letter spoke of love, of stolen moments, of a relationship that could never be public. Margaret's hands had trembled as she read it. This wasn't just gossip. This was potential scandal at the highest level. If this became public, it could damage the monarchy itself. She burned the letter in the fireplace as she suspected she was meant to do. She never mentioned it. But she knew, and the Queen knew that she knew. There was an understanding between them after that, unspoken but absolute. Margaret was not just a servant anymore. She was a guardian of secrets too dangerous to trust to anyone else. The years passed. Margaret never married, never had children. The palace became her entire world. Her sisters back in Ireland would ask when she was coming home for good, when she would settle down and have a normal life. Margaret would smile and say someday, knowing that someday would never come, because how could she leave? She knew too much. She had seen too much. She was woven into the fabric of this family's private life in a way that couldn't be easily undone. By her 20th year of service, Margaret had witnessed things that would fill books. She had been there during the constitutional crisis that was resolved behind closed doors. She had seen the family's reaction to scandals before the public relations teams shaped the narrative. She had heard conversations that would never appear in any official history. She was there the night the Queen received news that would have broken a lesser person. Margaret had been turning down the bed when the private phone rang. The Queen answered it, listened in silence, and then simply said, "I see. Thank you for informing me." After hanging up, the Queen had stood very still for a long moment. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed, her usual perfect posture crumbling. "Your Majesty?" Margaret had asked quietly. "Is there anything I can do?" The Queen had looked up at her with eyes that held decades of unshed tears. "No, Margaret. There's nothing anyone can do. Some things must simply be endured." Margaret had stood there uncertain until the Queen spoke again. "My mother told me once that being queen means carrying the weight of the crown even when it's crushing you. That showing weakness is not an option. That duty comes before happiness, always." She paused. "I have done my duty, but the cost has been so very high." It was the most vulnerable Margaret had ever seen her. For a brief moment, the Queen was not the monarch, not the symbol, but simply a woman carrying burdens too heavy for one person to bear. "You've been strong for so long, Your Majesty," Margaret had said softly. "No one could have done better." The Queen had wiped her eyes quickly, composing herself. "Thank you, Margaret. That will be all for tonight." Margaret had left, closing the door quietly behind her. The next morning, the Queen was back to her usual composed self, as if the moment of vulnerability had never happened. But Margaret remembered. She always remembered. By year 30, Margaret had become a fixture in the palace. The younger staff members treated her with a respect that bordered on awe. She was the one who had served the longest, who knew the most, who never broke confidence. But the weight of all those secrets had taken its toll. Margaret was 62 years old and felt ancient. The knowledge she carried felt like stones in her pockets pulling her down. She had spent 3 decades being the keeper of truths that could never be spoken. And sometimes, late at night in her small room in the servants' quarters, she wondered what would happen to all those secrets when she was gone. Would they die with her? Or would they eventually surface, revealed by someone with less loyalty and discretion? She never imagined that the Queen herself would be the one to ask her to break her silence. Margaret sat beside the dying Queen's bed and began to speak. 30 years of silence broken, 30 years of secrets released. "Where do you want me to begin, Your Majesty?" Margaret asked. "The beginning," the Queen said. "Tell me what you saw. All of it." Margaret took a breath. "I saw a family," she began, "that loved each other deeply but didn't always know how to show it. I saw people trapped by duty, by expectations, by the weight of history. I saw sacrifices that the public never knew about and pain that was never acknowledged." "Be specific," the Queen said. "I don't want platitudes. I want truth." So Margaret gave her truth. She told the Queen about the gambling debts she had discovered over the years, the letters she had found and burned protecting the family's reputation. She explained how one of the princes had lost nearly £500,000 over a decade. Money that was quietly covered up by selling off private assets. "He never knew I knew," Margaret said. "But I found the letters, the desperate pleas to private lenders. I made sure they were destroyed before anyone else could see them." The Queen's face was unreadable. "Go on." Margaret told her about the princess who had struggled with depression for years, who had tried multiple times to seek help, but was discouraged because mental illness was considered too stigmatizing for the royal family. Margaret had held her during panic attacks, had hidden medications, had called doctors in the middle of the night when things got bad. She needed proper treatment, Margaret said quietly. But the family was more concerned about appearances than her well-being. "I did what I could, but it wasn't enough." She suffered alone because admitting she needed help would have been seen as weakness. The Queen closed her eyes briefly. "I knew she was unhappy. I didn't know it was that severe. Why didn't someone tell me?" "Because you had already made it clear that the family's image came first," Margaret said, her voice gentle but honest. "Everyone around you learned to hide problems rather than reveal them. Not because they didn't care, but because they knew the protocol. Maintain appearances, no matter the cost." Margaret continued. She told the Queen about the staff members who had been mistreated by family members, the casual cruelty that happened when people forgot that servants were human beings with feelings. She told her about the young maid who had been reduced to tears by a royal's sharp words, and how no one had apologized because apologies implied wrongdoing, and royalty didn't admit wrongdoing to the help. She told her about the secret meeting she had witnessed between the Queen and a government official. A conversation about a decision that would affect millions of people. The official had presented two options, one ethical but politically difficult, the other expedient but morally questionable. Margaret had been in the room changing the flowers, supposedly invisible. "You chose the expedient option," Margaret said. "I remember because you looked so sad afterward. You told the official, 'Sometimes being queen means making choices that keep me awake at night.' I never forgot that." The Queen's hands gripped the bedsheets. "I thought I was alone in that room." "You were, in a way. I'm very good at being invisible." Then Margaret told her about the affair, the one the Queen had never publicly acknowledged, the relationship that had sustained her through years of a cold, duty-bound marriage. "I found the letters," Margaret said softly. "I destroyed them to protect you. But I want you to know something, Your Majesty. I never judged you for it. I saw your marriage. I saw how lonely you were. I saw how you maintained the appearance of a perfect royal union while dying inside. That man, whoever he was, gave you moments of happiness. You deserved those moments." Tears ran down the Queen's face. "No one was supposed to know, ever." "I know, and I never told anyone. But you asked me for truth, so here it is. You were human. You had needs and desires and a heart that wanted love, not just duty. There's no shame in that." Margaret continued story after story, secret after secret. She told the Queen about the family arguments she had overheard, the bitter words spoken behind closed doors. She told her about the grandchild who resented the restrictions of royal life and had planned to walk away from it all before being convinced to stay. She told her about the bribes and cover-ups, the strings pulled to keep scandals out of the papers, the compromises made to preserve the monarchy's image. She told her about the times the Queen had been magnificent, standing up for what was right even when it was unpopular. And she told her about the times the Queen had been weak, allowing fear of public opinion to guide her decisions instead of her conscience. "You asked me to tell you the truth about your family," Margaret said finally. "Here it is. You are all deeply flawed human beings trying to live up to an impossible standard. You made mistakes. You hurt people. You protected the institution at the cost of individual happiness. But you also showed courage, resilience, and dedication that most people can't imagine. You sacrificed your own needs for a role you were born into, not chose. That's both admirable and tragic." The Queen was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Did I do more harm than good?" It was the question of a lifetime, and Margaret knew her answer would matter. "I think," Margaret said carefully, "that you did what you thought was right with the information and choices you had. Could you have done better? Yes, we all could, but you were trapped by a system that was bigger than you, older than you, and you did your best within those constraints. Your children and grandchildren paid a price for that, so did you. So did everyone around you. But you also provided stability, continuity, and a symbol that millions of people believed in. Was it worth it? I don't know. Only you can answer that." The Queen looked at her with eyes that held both gratitude and grief. "Thank you for your honesty. It's more than I deserve." "Your Majesty," Margaret said, "you asked me earlier if serving you had been an honor or a burden. May I answer that now?" "Please." "It was both. It was an honor to witness history, to be trusted with the most private moments of one of the most famous families in the world. But it was a burden to carry secrets that I could never share, to watch people suffer and not be able to help, to see the cost of your choices and remain silent. I don't regret my service. But I also don't romanticize it. It was hard. It was lonely. And it cost me my own life in many ways." The Queen reached out and took Margaret's hand, something she had never done in 30 years. "I'm sorry, I never thought about what we were asking of you, of all the staff. You gave your lives to preserve ours, and we never properly thanked you." "We didn't do it for thanks," Margaret said. "We did it because it was our job. But acknowledgement would have been nice, yes." They sat in silence for a while, the dying Queen and the maid who knew all her secrets, holding hands like equals for the first time. Finally, the Queen spoke. "Margaret, I have one more question, the most important one." "Yes, Your Majesty. At the end of it all, looking back on my life, my reign, my family, everything I built and everything I sacrificed, did I find real love? Not duty disguised as love, not loyalty or respect or admiration, but real, genuine, human love." Margaret thought about all the years, all the secrets, all the moments she had witnessed, and she gave the Queen the answer she deserved. Margaret looked at the Queen, this woman who had ruled an empire, commanded respect from world leaders, and maintained an image of perfection for over 60 years. And she saw not the monarch, but the girl who had never been allowed to just be human. "Yes," Margaret said simply. "You did find real love. Several times, actually." The Queen's eyes filled with fresh tears. "Tell me, please, I need to remember." Margaret squeezed her hand gently. "You loved your children even when you didn't know how to show it. I saw the way you looked at them when they were sleeping, when no cameras were around, when you thought no one was watching. You would stand in their doorways and just watch them breathe. That was love. Pure and simple." "But I was so distant with them," the Queen protested weakly. "Protocol, duty, maintaining boundaries. I rarely hugged them. I let nannies raise them while I attended to state business." "You did what you thought was required of you," Margaret said. "But I also saw the notes you would write them late at night, expressing feelings you couldn't say out loud. I saw how you kept every drawing they made you, every card, every small gift. You have a box in your private closet filled with their baby shoes, locks of their hair, first teeth. You kept every memory. That's love." The Queen closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. "And yes," Margaret continued, "you loved that man, the one from the letters. I don't know who he was and I don't need to. But I saw how you changed after meeting with him. How you smiled more, how you seemed lighter, younger, more yourself. For whatever time you had together, he gave you something precious, the chance to be a woman, not just a queen." That was real love, too. It was wrong, the Queen whispered. I was married. Your marriage was a contract, Margaret said bluntly. An arrangement made for political reasons. You respected your husband, you partnered with him, you presented a united front. But the love you had for that other man, that was something different, something you chose, something that was yours alone. Don't diminish it by calling it wrong. It was perhaps the most honest thing you ever had. The Queen opened her eyes and looked at Margaret with something approaching wonder. How do you know all this? How did you see so much? Because people like me are always watching, Margaret said. We have to be. We need to anticipate needs, prevent problems, smooth over difficulties. And in the watching, we see everything. The things you think are hidden are visible to the people who serve you. We know when you're sad. We know when you're angry. We know when you're in love. We just never say anything. It must have been lonely, the Queen said, carrying all that knowledge alone. It was, Margaret admitted, but it was also beautiful in a way. I witnessed a life that few people ever get to see, the real life behind the crown, the human being behind the symbol. And yes, Your Majesty, you were human, flawed, complicated, sometimes selfish, sometimes extraordinarily generous. You made mistakes, but you also created moments of genuine beauty and grace. She paused, then added, There's one more love I haven't mentioned. What's that? Your love for your country, for the institution you represented. That was real too. I saw you stay up late, reading briefings, preparing for meetings, taking your role seriously even when you were exhausted. I saw you put your duty above your own happiness again and again. That's a kind of love too. Perhaps the most sacrificial kind. The Queen's voice was barely audible. Was it worth it? Margaret thought carefully before answering. I think you're asking the wrong question. Not was it worth it, but did it have meaning? And yes, it had meaning. Millions of people looked to you for stability. You represented continuity in a changing world. You gave people something to believe in. That matters. Whether it was worth the personal cost, only you can judge that. They sat in silence for a few moments. Then the Queen spoke again. Margaret, I want you to do something for me after I'm gone. Anything, Your Majesty. Write it down, all of it. Not for publication now, but someday when enough time has passed that the people involved are gone. Write the real story, not the sanitized version that will appear in official histories. The truth, the human truth. Future generations deserve to know that we were people, not just symbols. They deserve to know what this life actually cost. Margaret shook her head. I can't do that. I promised confidentiality. I promised silence. And I'm releasing you from that promise, the Queen said firmly, a flash of her old authority returning. This is a royal command, Margaret. Write it down. Let people understand that crowns are heavy, that thrones are lonely, that duty demands sacrifices that most people can't imagine. Let them see us as we really were. Your Majesty, please, it's the last thing I'll ever ask of you. Don't let the truth die with us, not all of it. Leave a record for history, for understanding. Margaret felt the weight of this new responsibility settling on her shoulders. If that's what you truly want, then yes, I'll write it down. Someday. Thank you. The Queen's voice was getting weaker. The conversation had exhausted her. One final thing. That box in my closet, the one with my children's memories, make sure they get it. Tell them I kept everything. Tell them I love them more than I knew how to show. I will, Margaret promised. The Queen's eyes were closing. Stay with me, Margaret, please. I don't want to be alone. I'm here, Your Majesty. I'm not going anywhere. Margaret held the Queen's hand as her breathing became slower. more labored. She watched as the woman who had been a symbol of strength for so many became small and vulnerable in her final moments. Just before the end, the Queen opened her eyes one last time and looked at Margaret. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me. Really seeing me." "It was my honor," Margaret said, and this time she meant it without reservation. The Queen died peacefully, holding the hand of the maid who had kept her secrets for 30 years. And in that moment, all the titles and protocols and formality fell away. There was just one woman helping another woman through the final passage we all must make. The Queen's funeral was a spectacle of pomp and ceremony watched by billions around the world. Heads of state attended. Military regiments marched. The public mourned a monarch they felt they knew. Margaret stood far in the back during the service, wearing her best black dress, just another member of the palace staff paying respects. No one interviewed her. No one asked for her perspective. To the world, she was invisible, just as she had always been. But the royal family knew differently. After the funeral, the Queen's private secretary summoned Margaret to his office. He handed her a sealed envelope. "Her Majesty left specific instructions regarding you," he said. "This is for you personally." Margaret opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a letter in the Queen's own handwriting, written weeks before her death, and a considerable sum of money. The letter read, "Dear Margaret, by the time you read this, I will be gone. I want you to know that our conversation in my final days meant more to me than I can express. You gave me something precious, honest truth, delivered with kindness. You reminded me that beneath all the protocol and pageantry, I was human. Thank you for that gift. The enclosed sum is to ensure your comfort in retirement. It's far less than you deserve for 30 years of loyal service, but please accept it as a token of my gratitude. I'm releasing you from your vow of confidentiality, but only partially. You may write the truth, but do so with the compassion you've always shown. Remember that we were people trying our best in impossible circumstances. You witnessed history, Margaret. Don't let it be forgotten. With respect and affection, Elizabeth R." Margaret folded the letter carefully and tucked it away. The money would allow her to live comfortably for the rest of her life. But more valuable than the money was the acknowledgement, the permission, the release from the burden of silence. She retired from palace service that year and moved to a small cottage in the countryside. She began to write, filling notebook after notebook with memories, with secrets, with the human story behind the crown. She didn't publish during her lifetime. Too many people were still alive, still protected by her discretion. But she created a record, detailed and honest, to be opened 50 years after the Queen's death. In the meantime, Margaret lived quietly. She volunteered at a local library, taught reading to children, and tended a small garden. She had spent 30 years in service to others. Now, finally, she could serve herself. Sometimes former palace staff would visit, sharing their own stories, their own burdens of secrets kept. They understood each other in ways that outsiders never could. They had all been witness to history, invisible participants in events that shaped a nation. "Do you regret it?" one of them asked Margaret once during tea in her cottage garden. "Giving up your own life for theirs?" Margaret thought about it. "I don't know if I gave up my life or if I lived a different life than I expected. I saw things most people never see. I was trusted with secrets that mattered. I helped, in small ways, to hold things together. Was it the life I would have chosen as a young girl in Dublin? No. But it was meaningful, it mattered. That's more than many people can say." Years passed. Margaret grew old in her cottage, her notebooks carefully stored away for future historians. She received occasional letters from the royal family, always polite, always brief, acknowledging her service without detail. The box of children's memories, as the Queen had requested, had been delivered to the royal children. Margaret heard later that when they opened it, several of them had wept, discovering for the first time the depth of their mother's private love for them. Margaret was 87 years old when she passed away peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by the books she loved and the garden she had tended. She left specific instructions about her notebooks. They were to be sealed until 50 years after the Queen's death, then donated to the Royal Archives. The sealed instructions included one final message. These are not the memoirs of a disgruntled servant seeking revenge or publicity. These are the observations of someone who loved the family she served, flaws and all. I have written with honesty, but also with compassion. My hope is that future generations will understand that the people who wear crowns are still people. They bleed when cut. They cry when hurt. They love and hate and fear and hope just like anyone else. The difference is that they must do all of this while carrying the weight of history, of expectation, of duty to something larger than themselves. That burden deserves acknowledgement, but so does their humanity. May these words help bridge the gap between the symbol and the person, between the crown and the heart beneath it. Margaret Flynn, keeper of royal secrets, servant, friend, and witness to history. Margaret Flynn's story reminds us of something we often forget in our fascination with wealth and power. The people who serve the powerful see everything. They are the silent witnesses to history, the keepers of secrets, the invisible threads that hold together the fabric of great institutions. We rarely think about them. We don't ask their names. We don't wonder about their lives, their sacrifices, their own dreams deferred. But they are there, always watching, always knowing, carrying burdens we can't imagine. Margaret spent 30 years in service to a family that ruled an empire, and in that time she learned truths that most people never access. That power is lonely, that duty is heavy, that the price of privilege is often paid in human happiness. She also learned that even the most powerful people are fundamentally human. They make mistakes. They struggle with the same questions we all do about love, meaning, legacy. They are trapped by their own circumstances just as surely as the maid who serves them is trapped by hers. The difference is that one trap is gilded and the other is not. But they are both traps nonetheless. When the Queen asked Margaret for the truth in her final days, she was asking for something more than facts. She was asking for acknowledgement of her humanity. She was asking if her life, stripped of all its ceremony and protocol, had contained the things that make any life worth living. Real connection, genuine love, authentic meaning. Margaret's answer was generous and honest. Yes, there had been love. Yes, there had been meaning. But there had also been a cost so high that it's difficult to calculate whether the balance sheet came out positive. Perhaps that's true for all of us, regardless of our station. We all make choices that cost us something. We all sacrifice parts of ourselves for duty, for family, for beliefs we hold dear. We all wonder at the end whether it was worth it. The Queen had the courage to ask that question out loud, and Margaret had the courage to answer it honestly. That final conversation was perhaps the most real moment in a life full of carefully scripted interactions. And maybe that's the lesson here. That truth matters. That being seen for who we really are matters. That at the end of our lives, the question isn't, how successful was I or how powerful was I, but was I loved? Did I love? Did my life have meaning beyond the role I played? Margaret Flynn knew the answer to those questions about the Queen because she had watched her live them for 30 years. And by giving the Queen the gift of honest truth in her final hours, Margaret provided something more valuable than decades of loyal service. She provided witness. She confirmed that the Queen's human struggles, her private loves, her secret sorrows were all real and valid. She reminded the queen that beneath the crown there had always been a person, and that person had mattered. The next time you see someone in service, someone whose job is to be invisible, to smooth over difficulties, to maintain the machinery of someone else's life, take a moment to really see them. They are witnesses to stories you'll never know. They carry secrets that would astonish you. They have sacrificed their own visibility so that others can shine. They deserve to be seen. They deserve to be thanked. They deserve to have their own stories told. Margaret Flynn was one of thousands of servants who have passed through the halls of power, leaving no mark, receiving no credit, asking for no recognition. But her story matters, because it reminds us that history isn't just made by the people whose names we remember. It's made by all the invisible hands that hold things together, all the quiet voices that speak truth when asked, all the loyal hearts that serve without expectation of reward. These are the people who know the real story. These are the keepers of truth, and when they finally speak, we should listen.